The morning of October 12, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Evans stood in the cramped Combat Information Center of the USS Benson, staring at a glowing screen that should have been impossible. In the darkness before dawn, with visibility reduced to less than 50 yards by fog and rain, the 5-inch cathode ray tube before him painted a crystal-clear picture of the convoy 7 miles distant. Every ship appeared as a distinct pip of light. He could count them. He could measure the spacing between them. He could see a coastline 15 miles away that his eyes would never perceive until sunrise, hours from now. 3 months earlier, this same equipment had been a useless curiosity, its effective range barely exceeding the distance a lookout could see with binoculars on a clear day. Now, through a modification so simple it seemed almost stupid in retrospect, American destroyers had gained the ability to see through darkness, fog, and rain as if the night itself had been switched off. The device responsible weighed less than a pound. It looked to the uninitiated eye like a chunk of copper with some odd cavities machined into it. But this stupid little component, born from a British engineer's refusal to accept the limitations everyone else considered fundamental, had just made every assumption about naval warfare obsolete. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how American destroyers learned to see in the dark begins not with the United States Navy, but with a 39-year-old British physicist named John Randall, working in a basement laboratory at the University of Birmingham in the winter of 1939 and 40. Randall was not a naval officer. He had never served aboard a warship. His expertise lay in an abstract field most military men couldn't even pronounce correctly: cavity resonance in electromagnetic radiation. Britain, in the opening months of the war, faced a problem that seemed insoluble through conventional means. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than British shipyards could replace them. The submarines operated primarily at night or in poor weather, conditions that rendered them effectively invisible until they were close enough to launch torpedoes. British destroyers and corvettes possessed radar systems, certainly, but these early sets operated at wavelengths measured in meters. The longer the wavelength, the less precise the information. A radar set operating at 1.5 meters wavelength might detect a submarine at 5 miles, but it couldn't tell you much beyond something large is somewhere in that general direction. For a destroyer captain trying to prosecute a contact at night, this was only marginally better than nothing. The fundamental limitation was power. To generate electromagnetic radiation at shorter wavelengths, measured in centimeters rather than meters, required far more power than existing vacuum tube technology could produce. The vacuum tubes of 1939 could generate perhaps 10 watts of continuous power at 10 centimeters wavelength. This was useless for radar. You needed thousands of watts, preferably tens of thousands, concentrated into pulses lasting microseconds. Every physicist who examined the problem arrived at the same conclusion: it couldn't be done with available technology. John Randall thought this conclusion was premature. In February 1940, working with his colleague Harry Boot, he began experimenting with a radical redesign of the standard magnetron tube. The conventional magnetron was a simple device, a heated cathode in the center, an anode surrounding it, and a powerful magnetic field forcing electrons to spiral outward. This spiraling motion generated electromagnetic radiation, but inefficiently and at low power. Randall's insight was almost absurdly simple in retrospect. Instead of allowing the electrons to radiate energy randomly as they spiraled outward, he would force them to do so in a controlled pattern. He machined a series of cavities, precisely measured holes, into the copper anode block. These cavities would resonate at a specific frequency, like organ pipes responding to particular notes. The electrons, spiraling through the magnetic field, would excite these cavities into resonance. The resonating cavities would reinforce each other. The reinforcement would extract energy from the electron stream far more efficiently than any previous design. On the 21st of February 1940, Randall and Boot activated their prototype for the first time. The cavities were dimensioned to resonate at 10 centimeters wavelength. According to their calculations, the device should produce perhaps 100 watts of power. They connected their measuring equipment. They energized the magnetron. The needles on their instruments slammed against the stops. They had to recalibrate. The actual output was not 100 watts. It was not even 1,000 watts. The cavity magnetron was producing 400 watts of continuous power at exactly 10 centimeters wavelength. Within weeks, they had improved the design. By midsummer 1940, the cavity magnetron could produce 10 kilowatts, 10,000 watts, in pulsed operation. This was 100 times more powerful than any previous microwave source. More importantly, the 10-centimeter wavelength meant radar pulses would reflect differently from different materials. A wooden fishing boat would produce a different return than a steel submarine. A periscope cutting through the surface would create its own distinct signature. An aircraft at high altitude would appear clearly distinct from ground clutter. The implications were immediately obvious to anyone who understood radar. With this device, you could build a radar set small enough to fit in a bomber, powerful enough to map terrain from 20,000 feet, precise enough to distinguish a factory from the surrounding city. You could build a naval radar that would show not just that ships were present, but how many ships, what size, and exactly where they were positioned relative to each other. You could detect a submarine's snorkel from miles away. You could track aircraft individually rather than as a blob on a screen. But Britain, in the summer of 1940, could not exploit this breakthrough alone. The island was fighting for survival. Factories were being bombed. Resources were scarce. The production capacity to manufacture cavity magnetrons by the thousands, and the radar sets to use them, simply didn't exist in Britain. The technology would have to be shared with someone who had factories, resources, and time. It would have to be shared with the Americans. The decision to transfer the cavity magnetron technology to the United States was not made lightly. The British were effectively handing over what might prove to be the most valuable military technology of the war to a nation that wasn't yet belligerent, that had no obligation to share the resulting developments, and that had its own competing radar programs. The risk was substantial, but the alternative, keeping the secret safe while losing the war for lack of production capacity, was worse. In September 1940, a small delegation of British scientists arrived in Washington carrying a black metal deed box. Inside that box, wrapped in felt and secured against shock, was a cavity magnetron. The Americans who examined it were initially skeptical. The device was simple, too simple. Surely something this crude-looking couldn't perform as claimed. The British demonstrated it. The American skepticism evaporated immediately. By October 1940, the radiation laboratory had been established at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, with a single purpose: develop radar systems using the cavity magnetron. The lab started with a handful of physicists. Within a year, it employed nearly 4,000 people. By 1945, it would be the largest single research facility in the United States, responsible for more than half of all American radar development during the war. The American naval radar program, before the cavity magnetron, had been adequate but uninspiring. The standard search radar aboard destroyers was the SC set, operating at 1.5 meters wavelength. It could detect aircraft at perhaps 20 miles under ideal conditions. Surface targets appeared as vague blurs at 10 miles or less. The resolution was poor enough that convoy escort work at night remained desperately difficult. You might detect that something was out there, but determining what it was and exactly where required closing to visual range, which rather defeated the purpose of radar. The radiation laboratory's mandate was to change this situation as quickly as possible. Their first production radar using cavity magnetron technology was the SG Surface Search Set, designed specifically for installation aboard destroyers and smaller vessels. The SG operated at 10 centimeters wavelength, generated peak power of 50 kilowatts, and promised a range of 15 miles against ship-sized targets, with resolution measured in yards rather than miles. The first production SG sets reached the fleet in early 1942. Installation aboard destroyers began in March. By summer, nearly 24 destroyers carried the new equipment. The results were immediate and dramatic. Commanders who had spent years developing an intuitive feel for night surface combat suddenly found themselves working with precise, reliable information. You didn't need to guess where the enemy was anymore. You could see him. You could track his course and speed. You could predict his position minutes in advance. You could maneuver without visual references, maintaining formation in conditions that would previously have forced ships to light searchlights and betray their positions. Lieutenant Commander Evans had received his first exposure to the SG radar in June 1942, during the Benson's refit at Norfolk. The installation team mounted the antenna, a rectangular array perhaps 4 feet wide, on the foremast above the bridge. They ran waveguide, not wire, from the antenna to the transmitter. Waveguide was a new concept for most sailors, hollow metal tubes that carried electromagnetic energy the way pipes carried water. The transmitter itself, with its precious cavity magnetron, was installed in a climate-controlled room. The receiving equipment and the display scope went into the Combat Information Center, a new compartment created specifically to exploit the new radar's capabilities. The first time Evans saw the SG in operation, he thought there had been a mistake. The display was too clear, too detailed. They were anchored in Hampton Roads at the time, with dozens of other vessels nearby. The scope showed every one of them, not as fuzzy blurs, but as distinct shapes. Large ships appeared as elongated returns. Small boats showed as tight, bright points. The coastline appeared as a continuous bright line with individual piers and breakwaters visible as extensions. He could see a buoy tender working 2 miles away, could track its movement as it serviced navigation aids. The detail was extraordinary, but detail while anchored in a safe harbor was one thing. The real test would come at sea in operational conditions when lives depended on the information the radar provided. That test came in August, during Benson's first combat deployment to the South Pacific. The destroyer was assigned to convoy escort duty, screening a group of cargo ships moving between Espiritu Santo and Guadalcanal. The route passed through waters where Japanese submarines operated regularly. An air attack was possible at any time. Surface action was unlikely, but not impossible. The convoy would be traveling at night without lights, maintaining radio silence. Evans, as the destroyer's executive officer, spent most of each night watching in the Combat Information Center. The SG radar ran continuously. At first he watched it simply because it was new and fascinating. But as the nights passed, he began to understand what the device was actually showing him. The 6 cargo ships in the convoy appeared as 6 distinct pips, their positions updating every few seconds as the antenna rotated. He could see when one ship drifted out of formation. He could measure the distance between vessels precisely. When a ship altered course, the change appeared on the scope immediately, long before any visual observer could have detected it. On the 4th night, Approximately 100 miles southeast of Guadalcanal, the radar detected a surface contact at 13 miles. The contact was small, moving slowly, roughly parallel to the convoy's course. Evans called the captain to the Combat Information Center. They watched the contact for 10 minutes, tracking its movement, calculating its speed and course. The mathematics said it was making perhaps 8 knots, which was too slow for a destroyer, but consistent with a submarine running on the surface to charge batteries. The captain ordered Benson to investigate. The destroyer accelerated to 25 knots, turning toward the contact. The range decreased steadily, 12 miles, 11 miles, 10 miles. At 8 miles, they should have been able to see the target visually if it was on the surface, but visibility that night was perhaps 3 miles in haze. The radar continued to track the contact perfectly. At 6 miles, Evans could see that the target had detected Benson's approach and was turning away. At 4 miles, the target disappeared from the scope. It had submerged. The Benson prosecuted the submarine with depth charges, though without achieving a confirmed kill. But the important point, the revelation that Evans carried away from that night, was how completely the dynamic had changed. 3 years earlier, that submarine could have operated on the surface with near impunity during darkness. Now, an American destroyer could detect it beyond visual range, close to attack range, and force it under the surface where its effectiveness was reduced to nearly nothing. The submarine commander had lost his greatest tactical advantage, the cover of darkness, because of a device the size of a fist, machined from copper, sitting in a climate-controlled box in Benson's transmitter room. The SG radar's impact extended far beyond anti-submarine warfare. In surface action, the advantages were even more dramatic. American destroyers had always carried superior fire control systems compared to Japanese vessels, but those systems required visual contact to function. In night surface engagements, the side that spotted the enemy first usually won because they could maneuver into advantageous positions and launch torpedoes before the enemy even knew they were present. Japanese destroyers, with their excellent optical equipment and superbly trained lookouts, had dominated night surface combat in the opening year of the war. The SG radar eliminated that dominance overnight. An American destroyer could now detect Japanese vessels at ranges where Japanese lookouts were still peering uselessly into darkness. The American ship could maneuver into torpedo launch position while the Japanese were still unaware of the threat. When the Americans finally opened fire, they did so from a carefully chosen range and bearing, often with the enemy silhouetted against the moon or shoreline, while the American ship remained invisible. The first major surface action where SG radar played a decisive role occurred during the naval battle of Guadalcanal on the night of November the 13th, 1942. The destroyer USS Fletcher, equipped with the new radar, detected Japanese vessels at nearly 15 miles range, far beyond what any lookout could hope to see on a dark night with scattered rain squalls. The Fletcher's captain, Commander William Cole, used that information to position his destroyer and others for a torpedo attack that helped disrupt a Japanese bombardment force. The action was confusing, violent, and costly for both sides, but American commanders had reliable information about enemy positions throughout the engagement, while Japanese commanders operated largely blind. Lieutenant Commander Evans heard about the Guadalcanal action from fellow officers who had participated. Their descriptions of the engagement focused repeatedly on one theme. The radar had shown them exactly where the enemy was, while the enemy had been forced to rely on visual spotting and guesswork. In a night surface battle, that information advantage was often the difference between landing the first effective blow and being struck before you could even determine where the enemy was located. One destroyer captain described tracking a Japanese cruiser through a rain squall, visually invisible, but perfectly clear on radar. and maneuvering into torpedo launch position while the Japanese ship's crew had no idea an American destroyer was within 10 miles. By early 1943, the SG radar had become standard equipment on American destroyers and destroyer escorts. The production lines at General Electric and other contractors were turning out magnetrons by the thousands. Each magnetron required precise machining of the copper anode block, careful assembly of the cathode structure, and meticulous quality control to ensure the cavities resonated at exactly the right frequency. But American industry, once tooled up for production, could produce them faster than ships could be built to carry them. The German and Japanese navies, meanwhile, struggled with radar development. Both nations had competent scientists and engineers. Both understood the JICE theoretical principles, but neither had access to the cavity magnetron's elegantly simple solution to the power problem. German naval radar operated primarily at longer wavelengths, limiting its resolution and effectiveness. Japanese naval radar development lagged even further behind. Japanese ships in 1943 were operating with radar sets that were, at best, equivalent to what American destroyers had carried in 1941, before the cavity magnetron changed everything. The asymmetry in radar capability created an increasingly lopsided tactical situation in night surface combat. American destroyers and cruisers could detect Japanese vessels first, track them precisely, and maneuver into advantageous positions before the Japanese even knew a battle had begun. The Japanese, who had spent the 1930s developing doctrine and training specifically for night combat, found their expertise negated by technology. The carefully honed skills of their lookouts couldn't compete with electronics that could see through darkness and weather. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The cavity magnetron's impact reached beyond surface combat. American submarines equipped with SJ surface search radar, using the same magnetron technology, could now detect enemy ships from the relative safety of periscope depth or even while surfaced at night. This was transformative for submarine warfare. Previously, a submarine captain searching for targets had to rely on visual sighting, which meant surfacing and scanning the horizon with binoculars, a vulnerable, time-consuming process. With radar, the submarine could detect targets at 10 miles or more, calculate their course and speed, and maneuver into attack position while remaining undetected. American submarines in the Pacific used this advantage to devastating effect against Japanese merchant shipping. Aircraft also benefited enormously from cavity magnetron technology. The H-2X radar, designed for installation in bombers, used a 10-centimeter magnetron to create ground mapping displays that allowed bombing through cloud cover. The displays showed cities, rivers, coastlines, and major structures clearly enough that bombardiers could identify specific targets without ever seeing them visually. Strategic bombing campaigns that would previously have been halted by weather could now continue regardless of cloud cover. But perhaps the most profound impact of the cavity magnetron appeared in anti-aircraft warfare. The SCR-584 fire control radar, deployed beginning in mid-1943, used cavity magnetron technology to track aircraft with extraordinary precision. The radar could determine an aircraft's altitude, speed, bearing, and range accurately enough to direct anti-aircraft guns without visual contact. Combined with the proximity fuse, another secret technology that dramatically increased anti-aircraft effectiveness, the SCR-584 created an aerial defense system that German and Japanese air crews found nearly impossible to penetrate. German bomber crews attacking England in 1943 and 44 discovered that their aircraft were being hit by anti-aircraft fire in conditions where visual aiming should have been impossible. At night, through clouds, in rain. The guns seemed to know exactly where the aircraft were, seemed to track them as they maneuvered, and seemed to predict their position seconds in advance. Some crews believed the British had deployed some kind of death ray. The truth was simultaneously more prosaic and more devastating. They were being tracked by radar systems so precise that gun directors could calculate firing solutions in real time. By mid-1944, cavity magnetron technology had diffused throughout the Allied military. Radar sets using the device were deployed on ships, aircraft, and ground installations across every theater of war. Production had scaled to the point where magnetrons were no longer precious commodities to be carefully rationed, but standard components installed in thousands of systems. The radiation laboratory at MIT employed more than 4,000 people working on dozens of different radar applications. British factories produced their own magnetrons and radar sets. Even Soviet forces received radar equipment incorporating cavity magnetron technology through Lend-Lease. The Axis powers, conversely, never successfully replicated the cavity magnetron during the war. German scientists examined captured British radar sets and understood the principle, but translating that understanding into mass production proved impossible under wartime conditions. The precise machining required for the cavity structure, the quality control needed to ensure consistent performance, and the manufacturing capacity to produce thousands of units were all beyond German industrial capability in 1944 and 45. Japan's situation was even worse. Japanese radar development had never reached the point where copying the cavity magnetron was even feasible. The gap between what Japanese engineers understood theoretically and what they could produce practically was simply too large to bridge. Lieutenant Commander Evans, by the autumn of 1944, had become so accustomed to having precise radar information available that he sometimes forgot how recently this had all been impossible. The SG radar on the Benson had been upgraded twice since its original installation. The current version could detect low-flying aircraft at 20 miles, surface vessels at 15 miles in calm seas, and could even pick up periscopes under ideal conditions. The Combat Information Center had evolved from a novel experiment into the ship's nerve center, the place where information from radar, sonar, visual observers, and radio all came together to create a comprehensive picture of the tactical situation. In November 1944, the Benson participated in a night surface action off Leyte Gulf. Japanese destroyers attempting to reinforce their garrison encountered American destroyers screening the invasion fleet. The action began at approximately 3 a.m, visibility less than 2 miles in rain and darkness. The Benson's SG radar detected the Japanese vessels at 14 miles. The American destroyers maneuvered into line, calculated firing solutions, and launched torpedoes, while the Japanese were still searching visually for their opponents. By the time the Japanese finally detected the American force, 3 of their destroyers were already sinking, and the Americans were turning away at high speed, hidden again by darkness and rain. Evans watched the entire action on the radar scope. He saw the Japanese vessels appear as bright pips at the edge of detection range. He watched them closely, saw their formation begin to dissolve as the first torpedoes struck, and tracked individual ships as they tried to maneuver away. The American destroyers suffered no casualties. The Japanese lost 3 destroyers sunk and 2 damaged, all before they had managed to establish where the American force actually was. The battle was not a victory of superior seamanship or tactics in any traditional sense. It was a victory of information. The Americans could see, the Japanese could not. In night surface combat, that difference was absolute. After the action, standing in the Combat Information Center while Benson retired at high speed, Evans reflected on the peculiar nature of technological warfare. 3 years earlier, he had been a junior lieutenant on a destroyer whose most sophisticated electronic equipment was a radio direction finder. Now he worked with a radar system that could paint a detailed picture of everything within 15 miles, regardless of visibility. The change had been so rapid that there had hardly been time to adjust psychologically. What had seemed miraculous in 1942 was routine in 1944. The cavity magnetron itself, the device responsible for all this, remained something of an abstraction to most sailors. They knew the radar worked. They knew it worked better than the old sets and could see farther and more clearly. But the mechanism by which electrons spiraling through a magnetic field excited precisely machined cavities into resonance at exactly the right frequency to generate coherent microwave radiation was not something the average quartermaster or fire controlman thought about. The magnetron was a sealed unit, replaced when it failed, maintained by specialized technicians who had undergone weeks of training just to understand the basics. Evans had once tried to understand the physics involved. He had read technical manuals, consulted with the ship's electronics officer, even requested detailed documentation from the Bureau of Ships. The mathematics was formidable. The electromagnetic theory required understanding concepts like wave propagation and waveguides, cavity resonance modes, and the behavior of electron streams in crossed electric and magnetic fields. He had given up after a few evenings of study, concluding that he didn't need to understand how it worked to understand what it meant for naval warfare. What it meant was that darkness no longer provided concealment. Weather no longer limited operations. The night surface battle, once the domain of crews with superior optical equipment and intensive training, had become a contest of electronics. The side with better radar won, usually decisively, usually before the side with inferior radar even realized a battle had begun. This was a new kind of warfare, one where information dominance mattered more than gunnery excellence or torpedo skills, though those remained important. The psychological impact on Japanese naval forces was difficult to measure directly, but could be inferred from their changing tactics. By late 1944, Japanese destroyers rarely sought night surface engagements with American forces unless circumstances gave them no choice. The aggressive night combat tactics that had worked so well in 1942 had become suicide by 1944. Japanese commanders had learned through bitter experience that American ships could detect them before they could detect the Americans, could track them as they maneuvered, and could attack from positions of advantage while remaining invisible. The learning process had been expensive. Dozens of Japanese destroyers sunk in actions where they never managed to establish where the American ships were located until torpedoes began striking home. The full story of the cavity magnetron's development and deployment would not become public knowledge until after the war. The device itself remained classified throughout the conflict. Sailors who worked with the radar sets that used it were forbidden to discuss the equipment's capabilities with anyone lacking proper clearance. Even discussing the basic fact that American destroyers possessed microwave radar was prohibited. The security around magnetron technology was tight enough that some American officers serving in secondary theaters never learned the details until they read about them in post-war technical publications. John Randall and Harry Boot, the British physicists who had created the cavity magnetron in that Birmingham basement in February 1940, received no public recognition during the war. The Official Secrets Act prevented them from publishing their work or even discussing it outside secure channels. They continued working on microwave devices throughout the conflict, contributing to various radar and communications projects, but their fundamental breakthrough remained hidden from public view. The recognition would come later, after the war, when the full story could finally be told. The impact, though, was visible to anyone paying attention to naval warfare in the Pacific. American naval forces operated at night with a confidence and aggressiveness that would have been reckless in 1941. Convoy screening could be conducted in total darkness without lights or radio communications. Surface action groups could maneuver in conditions that made visual navigation impossible. The night sea, once an environment of uncertainty and danger, had been rendered as navigable and controllable as daytime operations. More so in some respects, since radar wasn't affected by sun glare or haze. By early 1945, the transformation was complete. American destroyers carried so much radar equipment that the foremasts had become forests of antennas. Beyond the SG surface search radar, there was air search radar operating at longer wavelengths for early warning, fire control radar to direct the main guns, IFF, identification friend or foe, transponders to distinguish American aircraft from enemy, and radar altimeters for aircraft operating from nearby carriers. The Combat Information Center had expanded to accommodate additional plotting tables, displays, and operators. A destroyer's crew in 1945 needed to include electronics technicians who would have been considered specialists in 1941. Men trained specifically to maintain and repair the increasingly complex electronic systems. The cavity magnetron had enabled all of this. A device that weighed less than a pound, that could fit comfortably in a man's hand, had fundamentally altered the conduct of naval warfare. The change had been rapid, comprehensive, and irreversible. There was no going back to the old ways to rely on optical equipment and human eyesight. The information advantage provided by microwave radar was too great to abandon. Any navy that attempted to fight without it would be operating blind against an enemy who could see perfectly. Lieutenant Commander Evans understood this in an intuitive, practical way that required no advanced physics education. He had fought in actions where radar made the difference between victory and defeat. He had watched enemy ships appear on his scope long before any lookout could have spotted them visually. He had seen American destroyers maneuver through darkness and foul weather with absolute confidence in their position and awareness of everything around them. The technology had become indispensable. The thought of operating without it was now more unsettling than the thought of combat itself. In the final months of the war, as American forces closed on the Japanese home islands, the asymmetry in radar capability became even more pronounced. American ships operated with complete knowledge of their surroundings, while Japanese forces, their radar development having never caught up to Allied standards, remained largely blind to American movements until visual contact was established. Night air attacks
against Japanese positions were conducted with radar bombing, allowing American aircraft to strike in conditions that made Japanese defensive fire largely ineffective. Surface bombardments of Japanese coastal installations were directed by radar, the ships firing accurately at targets they could not see, adjusting their fire based on radar observation of where their shells were landing. The Japanese understood by this point that they faced a fundamental technological disadvantage. Captured American radar sets were examined carefully. Japanese engineers could see how the cavity magnetron worked in principle, but replicating it required manufacturing capabilities and materials that Japan no longer possessed. The industrial base needed to produce precision electronics at scale had been destroyed by American bombing. Even if the technical problems could be solved, there was no capacity to manufacture the devices in useful quantities. The knowledge existed, but the ability to exploit it did not. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.